Hello, my name is Jesan Sorrells, and this is the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, Shorts. There's no co-host on Shorts. These are 2 to 4 minute observations, ideas, thoughts, or rants about the literature, philosophy, psychology, and the theology of leadership. Because listening to me talk about leadership for 2 to 4 minutes is better than reading and trying to understand yet another business book.
Hello, my name is Jesan Sorrells, and this is the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, episode number 173. During this month, or during these last few episodes of the show, we have been discussing the nature of warfare and war making, and even the type of people who we ask to go out and make war. The psychological differences between men and women are numerous in this space. And in our current era in the West, various militaries, various quote unquote first world militaries, such as the ones in the United States, Great Britain, and Canada, most notably, are having trouble meeting their recruitment goals of getting young men to volunteer for military service. Many elite commentators floating ideas into the culture that eventually may become public policy and then become law have postulated in Canada, Great Britain, and the United States that a potential pool of soldiers who could be conscripted for service into frontline combat in places like, I don't know, the Ukraine, a pool might exist among young women. This idea follows on from the current cultural milieu where men and women are believed wholeheartedly to be indistinguishable, where women can do, quote unquote, anything that a man can do, only better, and where too many young women, and quite frankly, young men, have seen too many Marvel movies, which drives me absolutely crazy. The last 40 years of pursuing educational equity has produced college and university environments where 60% of undergraduates are now female. And it has led, as a knock-on effect, to a marital environment, I just saw this recently, where women now initiate 70% of all divorces. You can go check that stat out yourself as well. Into this cultural reality, at least in the United States and Western Europe, the idea that women should serve in frontline combat roles doesn't seem so illogical. And yet, many men, particularly young men, in most parts of the world where terrorism, warfare, and violence are the rule of the day, are still the ones that commit the most violence and die violently. Men still form the backbone of modern militaries and even glorified pre-modern militias like the Taliban, ISIS, and even the young men who died in droves in the Gaza Strip for the last couple of years. Men, particularly young men, still do the fighting, and men still do the dying outside of the egalitarian Western societies the majority of my listeners currently inhabit. And the reality of that fact can be observed throughout history, and so such a reality begs the question: what is the mindset of young men who, throughout history, have wanted to attack forward positions with zeal, knowing that the likelihood of death was high? This is a question that was asked in Sebastian Junger's book on war, which we covered just last episode. If we can't answer this question as a culture, and Junger made this point as well, and if men and women are really interchangeable, and if egalitarianism is really the rule of the day, then why not let women serve in the front lines of combat against all historical and cultural trends? The reason we're going in this direction today, the reason I'm asking this question, is because the book that we are covering, this theme of young men pursuing glory and honor and trying to become warriors in order to achieve status, is a theme that leaped from the pages of this book. And it's also a theme that leaped out to me, but we didn't have a chance to talk about it, in a similar book that we covered in episode number 157, where we talked about the writing of Ernie Lapointe. Today, on this episode of the podcast, we will be introducing and discussing the nature, I think, of warrior young men, their warrior mindsets, their fundamental inability to listen to wise old men who were once warriors, and what this all means for leaders in our rampantly egalitarian time. From the volume, The Earth is All That Lasts, Crazy Horse, Sitting Bull, and the Last Stand of the Great Sioux Nation by Mark Lee Gardner. Leaders, when leading young men and being responsible for channeling their enormous energies, walking a fine line is the only kind of walk to which you are going to want to commit. And joining me today, as is our wont, is my good friend and co-host on the show, Tom Libby. How you doing this afternoon, Tom? How you doing today?
I was doing fantastic until about 5 minutes before we hit the record button. I had personal catastrophe, but not anything serious, folks. Not like a life-threatening thing, but it was a funny thing that Hasan and I got a chance to laugh about for a couple minutes before we hit the record button. But otherwise, yes, I am doing fine and dandy. Hasan, thank you very much for asking.
Hey, you're welcome. You're welcome. And his personal catastrophe. I'm laughing about it. I'm laughing at his pain as
As we often do to each other.
As we often do to each other, or as Kevin Hart might intone. Does actually kind of tie into, I made the point before we hit record, does kind of tie into what we're talking about here today. We introduced The Earth is All That Lasts by Mark Lee Gardner in our previous episode number 172. I would recommend going back and listening to that before you listen to this episode today. But today we are going to be, as usual, as we do with copyrighted material, we're not going to be reading directly from the book, or we might read, there's one piece of one chapter, some observations that I think I'll directly read. But the vast majority of the book, we're going to summarize the themes and the content. And of course, we're going to bat about this idea of young men and combat, and counting coup and taking scalps and all of the kinds of things that are talked about in this book. Now, Tom has not read the book, but Tom has deep familiarity with the subject matter surrounding the book, and the subject matter of the book, which is the nature of the tribal wars that occurred between, quite frankly, the native tribes of not only the upper Midwest and the Midwest in between the 1860s and the 1880s, between them and the United States cavalry. Most notoriously, of course, in the Battle of Little Bighorn, where General George Armstrong Custer died ignobly. By the way, I just read about that in the book this weekend, and I gotta say, Tom, reading that from a strategic perspective and a tactical perspective versus just purely a cultural one, the thing that jumped out to me about that battle was, yes, the arrogance of Custer and all of that, but we just came off of reading a book about World War One. We just read John Keegan, so there were arrogant generals. Arrogance is not a thing just for Armstrong Custer. Like that's just kind of what you get. It was, the thing that jumped out to me was just how committed he was to a bad deal once it had gotten, like, he could have retreated at any time, but he kept not retreating. Yeah. And so it's like he threw good money after bad. And you see this all the time in business. You see this all the time in leadership. People see this in marriage. I mentioned the women initiating 70% of all divorces, which can be interpreted as a case of women no longer being willing to throw good money after bad, and willing to cut their losses. It is one interpretation. I'm not saying it's the interpretation. I'm saying it's one. But in general, you do see people who fall into this sunk cost fallacy. And a sunk cost fallacy basically states, well, I'm already in this thing. I might as well keep going and get to the end. And the problem with that is, just like Custer at Little Bighorn, you can lose everything, including the lives of other people, if you don't know when to retreat. And that's the biggest thing that jumped out to me, was just how little Custer understood about exactly the negotiation that he was in. And I'm not asking you to comment on that. I'm merely saying that was the observation that I had there.
No, it's a good observation though, because if you go even before Little Bighorn happened, like days and weeks before that, Custer was warned about this from superior officers and saying, don't take certain things for granted, don't do this, don't do that. And he did it anyway, because to your point about the arrogance, and then he ultimately sacrificed the entire 7th Cavalry, right? Like, so
Correct. Yep.
it's and again, I think that in modern times, we see it every day in the form of startup founders that lean into some ideal that they have without actual factual data to support it. And they just continue down a path. They go through their entire life savings, and they're only to realize the idea wasn't good enough or didn't work or whatever. Like, we still have the same like we still see the same things today that we did in 1876 when the Battle of Little Bighorn happened. So
yeah, and I mean, this is and what we cover on this podcast. I've been saying this a lot as we've been talking about war, with the First World War with John Keegan, covering War by Sebastian Junger, about the battles of the 2nd Battalion in the Korengal Valley in Afghanistan in 2007 and 2008. Or this book talking about the tribal wars in the late 1860s, 1870s into the 1880s in the United States. What you see is this remarkable ability to engage in sunk costs consistently across all time, which tells me that this is a human problem, not one that is what do you call it, bracketed by any particular time or climb, or has anything to do with how particular people think in a particular kind of way. This is a human problem, and I don't know why human beings do this. I don't know if it's just the hope that things will get better, or, to your point about arrogance, the absolute arrogance and not being able to listen to good advice, or I don't know which one it is, or maybe it's a weird combination of all those things together that leads to the nonsense and the kinds of disasters that happen to, and the disaster that happened to the 7th Cavalry, or can happen to an entrepreneur who puts all of their money in Beanie Babies or something. And I'm not saying sure, your Beanie Baby in your basement is probably fine, I don't know, but don't bet on it. It's 2025. I maybe invest in something else.
I do agree with you, though. It's definitely a human problem, because it's not, to your point about whether there's no bracket in time. There's also no technology that has come about to make us get off of this wagon either. So if you can't point to a singular time, singular type of event, or a singular technology that gets us on or off this wagon, then it has to be like, if all like Occam's razor says the simplest answer is the right one, right? So
yeah,
if all else fails, it has to be us.
Well, and the thing is, technology is like caffeine. It allows us to do stupid things faster and better.
Yeah.
Right. And we're going to do the same thing with the LLMs. Like, this is already beginning to happen,
You're already starting to see it.
and whatever comes after the LLMs, if it's robotics or whatever. And now in warfare, we have this vision, and I talked about this a little bit when we talked about John Keegan's book, because of the nature of technological achievement. You and I talked about that during World War I, and sort of how that combined with sort of pre-technological thinking, that was still based in the idea of a mass amount of troops at a certain inflection point, right? By the way, you also saw this in the wars that are documented in this book, in The Earth Is All That Lasts. But now we have an idea, and you could see the shift in the book War by Sebastian Junger, where we only lost 50 guys in the Korengal Valley in 2 years. any military in the history of the world would take that. Any military in the history of the world would take those kinds of losses. And yet we still retreated from the Korangal Valley, a place that not even people who are native to Afghanistan would go into. We went into and we only lost 50 guys, and we still retreated because of political and cultural reasons. But let's put that aside. The reason we only lost 50 guys, even though 150 Taliban at a swoop would die in a battle, is because of superior technology and training. Yeah. It just is. It just is. You would read about, guys breaking down a 50 cal in the middle of a firefight while the barrel was still hot, reassemble the sucker and keep going. When has any military been able to do that in the history of the world? That's just better technology and better training. Right. Now, I'm curious in the future, as we move more into drones and cyber warfare, I think we will lose fewer people in war, but those inflection points are probably going to have more impact. And I wonder if human decision making is going to have to change, because it's easy to engage in sunk cost. This is the last thing I'll say about this, so we can jump into the book. But it's easy to engage in sunk cost when it's just a drone. It's just a $30 million drone. It's okay. We've got like 10 more in the back, and Raytheon will spin us up like 40 more before the end of the day. Like, it's fine.
Yeah, if the mindset changes, if there's no loss of life,
right, or if the loss of life is so minimal that it almost seems like, and I don't want to minimize war, I really don't, and it almost seems like a video game.
Yeah.
And that gets back to, of course, my initial point that I opened up with, which we could talk about more, but my initial point that I opened up with, which is, why not women in frontline combat then? I'll let you think about that. Let's go into the book a little bit. So when you open up The Earth Is All That Lasts, by the way, this book is highly researched. The appendix alone and the notes, I think, and I said this in the intro, the appendix alone and the notes and the level of interviewing that Gardner did is almost 200 pages just by itself. It is ridiculous, the amount of work that he put in. He even talked to Ernest LaPointe about Sitting Bull, and I think probably also about Crazy Horse. But Gardner did his research, and he's reporting accurately and writing accurately, although you can tell me if I'm wrong on this, Tom. You have much more knowledge of this than I do. I think he's reporting accurately, at least as best he can, directly from source material about what actually happened during these battles. And you can even see it in the writing of the book.
I feel like you took a very journalistic approach to this, where a journalist would go and, to your point about he found resources that validated resources. It wasn't just like, I went to a museum and I read a couple of plaques on the wall in this museum. He read the plaques on the wall in the museum, took it as fact, but then found where the museum got that information. Like, he did this several times in multiple layers. The one thing the only thing that stands out to me that is difficult for me is, I mean, it seems very matter of fact, and it seems very again, very well researched, but it's hard to capture the feel of a people not being part of those people.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? Like, so when he talks to Ernie LaPointe, he can get Ernie LaPointe's vantage point of how those wars impacted him 3 generations, 4 generations later, and how it still impacts him today. But he himself cannot write that from a standpoint of experience. He has to write it from a standpoint of research. That's the only thing about this book that I think kind of leaves anything to be desired. That's the only part. So if you're looking at it from a purely educational standpoint, sure, it checks the boxes. It checks it does the ones and zeros, but it's very difficult to get the emotional part of writing from him from the people's perspective.
I would agree with that. It does come off like the reportage that Sebastian Junger did in his book War, that we also covered. It strikes less of a historical tone like Keegan did with the First World War. And so it's without being there, how are you going to get that emotion? Without being there with the 7th Cavalry or without being there with the Lakota, how are you going to get that kind of emotion, right? Even, by the way, people like LaPointe, and I wouldn't knock LaPointe, but I would even turn that critique on LaPointe. I would say, well, as I sometimes will say during the books that we cover during Black History Month, sometimes, particularly from Malcolm X or the writings of Martin Luther King Jr., I was born after all that was over. Like, there's no emotional connection for me in that kind of way, right? To the ideas that those writers are writing about. And so without being there, I don't know how any of the parties get to sort of the emotional heart of the matter of these events.
I totally understand and agree with what you're saying, and I get that. It's not necessarily the emotional value of the actual event at hand, but there's intrinsic value that escalates through generations after the fact that Ernie LaPointe could potentially feel, right? Things that happened because that's that whole the ripple effect, right? So things that happened that day still impact him today, whether we want to feel that or not is not but it does. We know it does. We know what generational trauma looks like, and we've had conversations about how generational trauma impacts several other ethnicities, and not just Native, but the Irish from the potato famine, the Black history over the course of slavery, et cetera, et cetera. Because you could say the same thing. Black people today they've never, like, their grandparents never experienced slavery, but that does not mean that the slavery does not impact them today. They still have emotional scars, whether they think it or not. And some of them want to move past it. And I totally agree with that. And again, same thing for us. Like certain things that happen, you try to find a way to move past it, because if you don't and you start to dwell on those things, you drive yourself crazy. You'll drive yourself absolute bonkers by trying to rationalize it or fix it. There's no way to fix the past. You can't go back and fix it, but we tend to try. We try to course correct so hard that we create other problems that weren't really related to, et cetera, right? So it's like, it's not that Ernie LaPointe needed to be at Little Bighorn for it to impact him, but that's what I'm getting at with Mark Lee Gardner here. He has neither attachment, whether it be at the event or ripple effects down the line of generational trauma that happens after the fact. He's purely looking at it from a research and article driven kind of mentality. He's an encyclopedia-opic kind of writing this, which again, I'm not suggesting it's a bad thing, because to me, sometimes that's better, because you get to, it's like the, what is it? What is the TV series? Dragnet? Just the facts, ma'am.
Oh, just the facts, ma'am. Yeah.
Don't tell me a story. Tell me just the facts, which this does really well. And it's so well researched that you do get really factual information based on it. So again, from that perspective, it's great. All I was saying is that this particular time frame in our country does have some emotional impact that lasted generations beyond it, and he can't capture that. There's no way for him to.
Yeah, well, I would say he makes a bit of an attempt when you're looking at the structure of the book. He makes a bit of an attempt in looking at the interviews that Sitting Bull gave later about what had happened during that time. Also looking at not the interviews, but looking at the writings and the letters of people who were there at the time, including Indians who were taken prisoners, but also whites, for lack of a better term, who were taken prisoner by the Lakota or the Hunkpapa or various other tribes, right? The Cheyenne, the Comanche, trying to get those perspectives. He also, interestingly enough, in the structure of this book, and I thought this also jumped out to me, I don't want to say cherry picked, because he's building an argument here. So he's going to pick the things that fit his argument, which is fine with me. Um, he pulls from newspaper writings and editorials of the day and lets those perspectives sort of speak for themselves, right? So when he quotes from, a newspaper in Montana that is funded probably by people from back east who want to see, something happen in Montana, or folks in Colorado, particularly, the settlers who went to Colorado, who massively despised the Indian tribes in Colorado because they thought that somehow they were stopping them from getting gold, which of course was non-existent, but let's just leave that aside for just a second. Or the Black Hills, like everything that happened with the Black Hills and that whole entire area, and the perceptions of folks that looked at the Black Hills in one way, and then of course the native tribes who looked at it in a totally completely different way. And the way that was publicized, I think he gets to somewhat of that emotional tenor by quoting directly from those people. You do get some of that, and I think that's probably, to your point, as close as you're going to get to kind of a on the ground perspective, I guess. And here's the other piece, and we always have to keep this in mind when we're reading books that are written about historical events. The further and further away we get from the thing, and we've seen this in a lot of books that we've covered on this show that have been historical books, the further and further away you get away from the thing, yes, the more disconnected you become from it emotionally. And that's not to say the trauma doesn't exist, but the more disconnected you become from it relationally and emotionally, but also the more resources and information is available, weirdly enough.
Scarcity of it, yeah.
Yeah. So, I often think I try to transpose my brain sometimes, when I'm, awake at night. I will transpose my brain 1,000 years forward and wonder, what the hell kind of books are people going to write about all of us? Because everything that could possibly fall out of our mouths is now published on the internet.
Yeah.
And will be preserved 1,000 years from now. Oh my God. The Markley Gardner 1,000 years from now.
I do the opposite. I sit and think, I do not want to know what they're writing. I have no faith. I have no faith in us whatsoever that it's going to come out all right.
No, I think the people 1,000 years from now will be perpetually fascinated. Like, there are volumes and volumes and volumes of books written about the Roman Empire because you're perpetually fascinated with those people, because the average person had no voice in the Roman Empire. We don't know what the average person who was bringing in a cart full of like donkeys or sheep or whatever to trade in Rome at 3 o'clock in the morning. We have no idea what that person thought, because the vast majority of people throughout the history of the world up until about 10 minutes ago were illiterate. They were unable even to write their own names. Well, with the explosion of literacy, the explosion of now information technology, back to the point about technology, 1,000 years from now, people will know more about us. Now, what judgments they will make about us,
that's what I'm saying. I don't want to know. I don't want to know.
And I think they will be endlessly fascinated, and they will not be able to figure us out. Even with all our available data, they'll be like, I still don't understand these people. It should be fascinating. That should be fascinating. All right, back to the book. So we open up The Earth Is All That Lasts, and you start off with, and I really liked this, that he sort of begins, or Gardner begins with this idea of the Lakota idea of not wanting a young man to live to be an old man, to die young on the battlefield, right? That's the way a Lakota dies. So I want to talk a little bit about that, because that sort of creates the thread that goes through this entire book. It's this idea of young men who are seeking warrior status, who have a lot of energy, and there's only one spot they have to put it. They're not going to become agrarian, walking behind a cow or a donkey. I think that, and I've asked this question, on the show before, and I will revisit this a little bit later on, but could the native tribes in the upper Midwest and in the Midwest have lived as they lived traditionally if the wars hadn't happened? Could that way of life have continued down through the 20th century? And increasingly, I think the tragic answer is no. I think industrialization would have gotten those folks, if the U.S. cavalry hadn't gotten them, industrialization would have gotten them. Industrialization and commercialization. So those are like two twin hammer blows that really hit those folks in those areas.
If you want a reference point to support your hypothesis,
yeah,
think of the New England area in the 200 years earlier, right? So the mid 1600s comes along where King Philip's War in 1675. Basically, King Philip was trying really, really hard to get all of the New England tribes on the same page and fight with him against the English, Puritan kind of establishment. And after that war, we don't have to talk about the whole thing, but just to quickly summarize.
Yep.
After that war, realizing the natives were not going to win the war against the Puritans, a lot of the Abenaki people in the northern part of Massachusetts and southern Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine basically just left. They were like, so you had three choices: assimilate or die. No, two choices: assimilate or die. You either became part of the cog or you died. And rather than do that, they left. So that was the third choice: assimilate, die, or leave. So they all went to the St. Lawrence River Valley area up in Canada. I'm getting to my point here. Now comes the American Revolution, the Industrial Revolution, where all of these factories are being built, and we're looking for population in order to get these factories up and running. And this is in the mid 1800s, so almost 200 years later, and a bunch of those native people just came down naturally to work in the factories. So there's an influx of native people came back from Canada because, to your point about their quote unquote way of life, it was faltering then, and they already started seeing it getting chewed up and spit out. So they were looking at what's next, and they just decided to come back down and work in the factories. Now they came under the guise of we're French Canadian, and they weren't native because they didn't want their kids taken from them. And we don't have to get into all that about the boarding schools, et cetera, et cetera. But if they passed for Canadian or whatever, French Canadian, that's what they came back to and started specifying as. And then there was all this hush hush about having native in your family lineage and whatever, but you just didn't talk about that in public because, again, you knew what was happening to natives across the country in the West. So you just didn't do that. But again, to your point, to at least give you a glimmer of your thought process might have been right, because we saw that in the eastern part of the country with the Industrial Revolution. So whether it happened in the late 1800s, early 1900s, maybe it lasted until World War II or the Depression, but eventually, I do agree with you that some sort of technological advancement would have caught up, and they would have either paid attention to it, noticed it, or wanted part of it, right? So even if they were able to extend it, let's give them the hugest benefit of the doubt. Let's say they extended it 100 years. So from 1860 to 1960. If you think about all those civil rights movements that happened and all that, I don't think they would have been able to stay isolated.
Yeah. And that's the thing.
There would have been a natural progression to modernize, and especially based on what they were seeing happening in their, let's say for what it was. If the U.S. cavalry didn't go in there, their neighbors, right? So their neighbors would have been having all this stuff impacting them. And even if they became friends and allies with the United States government, that would have created a completely different ball of wax that I don't think they would have been ready for. So again, as much as I would love to think that everything would have been copacetic and our native ways would have been fine, I'm not so sure about that. And I think history did give us some insights as to how that would have happened.
Yeah. Well, and you see this in so the Lakota versus the Pawnee, right? So here's something that also I think Gardner does a really good job in pointing out. It wasn't just the white immigrants coming across the country from the east looking for gold or mining or prospecting or as part of the cavalry or surveying for railroads, which is the industrialization piece. It wasn't just that. That was a thing. Don't get me wrong. And because you can have multiple different things inside of this dynamic, you had the Lakota versus seemingly everyone else. It wasn't until like close to the end that they all kind of got the religion, and I use that term small r loosely, the belief that maybe it might be a good idea for us to stop screwing each other over. And maybe we have a common enemy. Now, by the time they got to that point, by the way, to paraphrase from Red Cloud, and people Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse disrespected Red Cloud, I think, tremendously. But Red Cloud, he kind of could see the future, and he wasn't wrong. He said, the white people are going to keep coming anyway. What are we doing? And by the way, you saw this in some of their negotiations around the Black Hills. So the pro-treaty tribes who were negotiating around the Black Hills, it was kind of amazing to me. The chief's selling price around the Black Hills steadily increased over the course of the negotiations until it finally reached $70 million. I thought that was brilliant. I put a star next to that, and I was like, this is the way of the future. If industrialization, let's take the cavalry out of it. If the movement of peoples is going to continue west, and maybe this is me being an old man and not wanting to I don't need to count coup anymore. I don't need to go off and have a war and fight. I'm not driven by any of those things like young men are driven. $70 million. I can set up some intergenerational stuff with that money, right? And I'm not saying that they would have gotten that out of the Grant administration, the President Grant administration. I think that was probably outrageous. But they were on to something, I think, that Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse both missed.
The U.S. government may not have had that kind of money at that point anyway.
Yeah, $70 million was the entire federal government at that point.
We didn't have a $3 trillion budget the way we do today. I mean,
or $38 trillion in debt. Like we were still tied to the gold standard, and come on, that's the reason for the gold rushes and things like that. But I think that Red Cloud and Spotted Tail and all those chiefs were, I think they were onto something.
I also think, again, this is really hard to be judgmental about today because
right, yeah,
because and again, you saw this. We talk about this on this podcast, Jesan, 1,000 times about how history just continues to repeat itself over and over. Yep. I just gave you an example about King Philip's War that happened in the early, in the mid 1600s. It happened again in the 1700s with Tecumseh and him trying to go up and down the Mississippi, trying to collect as many tribal affiliations that he could in order to stop that westward movement up into the Mississippi, never mind after and beyond the Mississippi. And he failed. And by the way, there's always an underlying thing here about, and I didn't live at that time, and we certainly can't talk to Sitting Bull and Red Cloud here, but there was a disconnect between them because of what Sitting Bull and people like Crazy Horse would have viewed as greed on his part, right? Like you're signing these treaties, and all you're concerned about is your small village of people, and you're not worried about the rest of the Lakota, right? So whether it's Hunkpapa, Teton, or Oglala, whatever, there's all these bands of Sioux, and Red Cloud was worried about his people. So he's signing, to your point, whether he foresaw the future or not, I don't think that was as important to him at the moment as it was self-preservation and thinking, because think about it, as the westward came, they hit Red Cloud first.
Yep.
So all that, he had already encountered all that death and destruction and all that stuff. So he was already a beaten man by the time the cavalry and the U.S. cavalry got out to face Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull. So
Hmm.
they're and to your point, if they were looking at it from the right perspective, they could have been looking back at their future, so to speak. And they
Right.
didn't want to admit that, or certainly didn't want to, and nor did they feel the need to admit it after Little Bighorn
well, and this is the thing. So this is
and
why I
Rosebud. By the way, we're
and
forgetting about
Rosebud,
Rosebud.
Rosebud.
I know
Yep.
that Little Bighorn was probably the most famous, but Rosebud was just as important of a battle to them, and they won that battle. So
Hmm.
it's again, there's a lot of moving parts here, I know, and there's a lot of psyche and bravado and again some arrogance but to your point with technological advancement, I think that and by the way, there are some historians that will give you a single point of reflection in that time frame that literally changed the course of history, and that was the invention of the howitzer.
Oh yeah. Hmm.
Right. So like you can say a lot of things but if it had it not been for the invention of the howitzer, these things might have played out differently.
Well, and the lack of interest. No, how can I frame it? Because we live after World War II. And hell, because we live in a world where I can see a death like the death of, I'm going to name two. I can see the death of George Floyd or the death of Charlie Kirk live on my phone, literally the instant that it happens,
Or minutes after.
or minutes
Like
after.
literally, as opposed to even when we were kids,
Oh,
it
yeah,
was a day later because the news cycle was longer because it took time to research this, find out what happened, et cetera, interview people.
exactly.
Like
Yeah,
we didn't have that instant, like how many phones
right.
were available at the time?
Exactly. And so I think we confuse this. This is the arrogance of the current era. We take our arrogance in the current era and we look at um the nature of interactions between people in the past where yes, in their time they thought communication was instant and fast,
Yeah.
and in comparison to where communication went it was slow and ponderous. Okay, if Tecumseh had had a cell phone, like, let's run that experiment, right? Or if Sitting Bull had had the internet, which by the way, Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, the Lakota, the Sioux, in general, as part of their attempts to keep the white settlers out, took down the telegraph poles, which is kind of interesting to me because number one, I'd never heard of that detail before. But number two, it showed both a fundamental understanding, but also a fundamental misunderstanding of exactly what was happening. Both
Yeah.
things occurring at exactly the same time, and so we look at this, and this goes to buttress my point. We look at it from our era, and we go, "Well, if I had been no, 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 no. If you'd
No.
been there, you probably would have done exactly what those people did because you would have only had access to those resources then." And
And that
this in the exactly and that data and the data, the key data that the American that the tribal peoples west of Texas, north and west of Texas, missed totally and completely was the Civil War. That was the biggest piece of data they missed. And that was the opportunity to catch the Americans napping.
yeah.
And they didn't even
Well, so
it
here's
didn't even
here's
it
the
didn't even it didn't even hit them. Like they're like, I don't know, something's going on, the white people are killing, I don't know, they're not bothering us, we can go shoot buffalo, which is fine, by the way. Maybe that's what you needed to do, but I also think it was an instance of they didn't have the information
yeah.
because the technology wasn't there, and I'm not even
Yeah,
quite sure they would have
but
known what to do with it once they got it.
our statement in the beginning of this episode of this podcast that we're recording right now, we talked about the technology probably doesn't matter. And I'll give you another example of why you are right to say that and why right now we're like the way that you're saying this, like you're talking about technology and accumulating data that might have been helpful. I don't think so. And let me explain why. So again, go back to the early 1800s and the divide and conquer of the Cherokee people. The Cherokee, and by the way, if any of our listeners here are Cherokee, I'm going to super paraphrase this, so don't vilify me for trust me, we don't have enough time to go through the entire rigmarole of how the
We don't.
Cherokee government was dismantled by the US government through contract negotiations and then just pushed right out. They basically did a divide and conquer. It was, to your point, Hassan, had nothing to do with technology. It was purely simple human interaction, and they realized how to manipulate humans. They took the Cherokee land and government, divided it into four, and said, we're going to give, these four people are the only. They essentially said, we're going to treat you like a real government, but because we're treating you like a real government, you speak now for all of your people, you speak for all your people, you speak, et cetera, et cetera. And three out of the four people decided to sign off on the removal act. Like, they said it was okay to remove them from their land. And again, for those of you who are listening, if you happen to be Cherokee descent, I know that I'm butchering this a little bit. We don't have time to go into all the details.
Yeah.
But the reality of it is, go now, fast forward to what we were just talking about with this particular scenario. The manipulation of people is going to be far greater, far more powerful than any technology they could have ever implemented.
Yes,
right?
I agree with that. Yes.
So again, I said a second ago that the howitzer changed everything, and I still stand by that. But what it changed was the whole divide and conquer of the tribal affiliations that started to become one. People saw that, they got scared. They said, I have to save my people, so we're going to go sign our own treaties. And they started basically dismantling that union that started to form with those tribes. It was still human to human problems that created the defeat, but that advent of that technology scared the absolute bejesus out of people.
Yeah. Well, and let me bring up another point, which is not in my notes, but it's okay, because this is what happens when I have a conversation with Tom. I think about things that aren't in my notes. There is something about, and I'm going to approach this from the other end of the telescope. So normally I would say the power of European, no, let me frame it this way. I'll frame it a different kind of way. The 1500 years that the Europeans had of beating the brakes off of each other, about religion, about economics, and about politics, the conclusions that came out of that beating the brakes off of each other on that one continent for 1500 years, with, by the way, almost no external pushing on that, right? The Chinese didn't come down the Silk Road and invade Europe. The closest the Muslims ever got was at the siege of Vienna in 1683. And I mean, the Ottoman Empire basically got stalled at the gates of Europe with the siege of Vienna in 1683, which was a miracle, by the way. A miracle that, from the European perspective, this is what I mean by miracle, a miracle from the European perspective that if the Ottomans had been successful, our total entire world history would have been completely different, would have looked completely different. But the only reason that the Europeans were able to form that miracle, and to your point about the Cherokees being broken up into these four federation pieces, the only reason the European tribes at the siege of Vienna in 1683 were actually able to get their crap together was because they united under one king. That's the only reason. But it took 1500 years from the decline of the fall of the Roman Empire to that point for them to be able to put down their tribalism long enough to unite for literally 5 minutes, by the way, and then go right back to beating the brakes off of each other for another 200 years. Yeah. So normally I would approach this point from that perspective, but I'm going to approach that point, the same point, but from the Minority Report perspective. And you see this, when the results of European warfare and war making land on other peoples and other continents, who did not wind up at the same conclusions after going through that kind of human to human interaction, like in Africa, in Asia, in South America, and in North America. Those peoples look at the European way of engagement as foreign.
Mm.
And I don't think we appreciate that nearly enough as historians. I don't think historians make this point at all because it's a counterpoint and a minority report point. And it has nothing to do with guilt or supremacy. I'm not talking about the supremacy of quote unquote white people. I'm not talking about the supremacy of quote unquote European thinking. I am merely saying that when the results of that thinking show up to other places in the world that have adopted other thinking, it is foreign to those other places. And we see that in this book. Red Cloud, even though he could negotiate, the way in which the white settlers thought about him was still foreign to him.
Yeah.
Sitting Bull didn't even bother trying to get into their psychology until much later, after all the fighting was done. And Crazy Horse, I'm going to say something right here. God bless that man. That dude was a warrior from the jump, right? Like, he and just like a warrior, there's a whole incident that's talked about in the book where he basically took somebody else's wife in the tribe that he shouldn't have, and it wound up being a giant mess.
I thought you were going to talk about. I thought you were going to talk about the battle. Was it Muddy River or?
Oh yeah, or was it Muddy River or Greasy Grass?
Greasy Grass, where he he puts his shirt on and he basically runs his horse right in front of everybody firing guns at him. I mean, this guy
and they all missed.
Every one of them missed. So I mean, everybody else is like, yeah, he's invincible. We're going to follow him. Like he was like. He's like, I'm invincible. Let me prove it. I'm gonna go run my horse in front of all these guns, and I'm not. And he did. How did that happen? Like, I still look at this today, and I'm going, I think I would have thought that guy was a god. If that happened today, and somebody in the middle of a war said, "Don't worry, I'll stand on that hill, and I won't get hit," and they just stood up on the hill as everybody was firing guns at them, and they're like, "See, they can't hit me." I'd have been like, "F it, I'm beyond. Hey, he just said F around and find out and won. I'm going with that guy." Like, how did he? It's crazy to me that he was able to do stuff like that. And then, of course, like you said, he didn't know what we know today, and we know today that those guns are not exactly accurate. I mean, these are not 30-06s with scopes on the front.
No.
Or they can hit a deer at 500 yards or whatever. These guns, we know these guns are not exactly accurate. We know that today. They didn't know that.
They didn't know that. No. And that was the best accuracy. I mean, give me a break. Like, come on. Like, to your point earlier, we made this point earlier in another book that we covered, another episode. You could fire arrows as fast as they could load the breech loaders, or faster. The Sharps carbine. I mean, I fired a Sharps before. Number one, those guns are heavy. People underestimate just how much they weigh. Good Lord. But then number two, to your point about accuracy, kind of not the best. But that's because we live in a time when you have much more accurate weapons. Things have improved. I was actually just breaking down some of my pistols the other day and cleaning them. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, I do own pistols, along with several other pieces of armament in my house. And you can also all ask me about that later. I was breaking them down and cleaning them and putting everything back together. And I'm always amazed at weapons technology. I am always amazed at weapons technology because the difference in accuracy between, the 45 that my grandfather carried in World War II versus the 45 that we've got now is, I mean, they're fundamentally the same weapon, but the accuracy is just better. The materials technology is just better. Even the rounds are just better. Like, it's just insane. And so when you have a guy like Crazy Horse, who, by the way, his actual name, I love this, is his horse is crazy, not Crazy Horse. Yeah. His horse is crazy. I love that. When you have a guy like that That guy is less concerned from a mindset perspective about what's going on in the enemy's mind. He doesn't care about that. He only cares about what he's going to do to the enemy. That's all he cares about. And by the way, you saw that in the whole incident with the woman and all of that, and the going back and forth. Like, he wasn't worried about what that dude was going to do. He was just like, yeah, I don't know. This woman's coming over here. This woman's coming over here. We're going to hang out. Okay. Somebody, and if I had been advising him, I would have whispered in his ear, listen, his horse is crazy. Listen, the enemy gets a vote. Just keep that in mind. The enemy gets a vote.
Yeah, but
and that's and then the but would have been the whole thing after that.
But you have to so I'll bring this back to modern days, right? Like in business sense, right? So and by the way, as a sales and marketing consultant, I kind of have the same mentality as Crazy Horse to my clients sometimes, because what do you care what they're doing? Like, why do you get, like, what if you are in direct competition with another company that is in the next town over? I'm just using an example, but let's say I'm a plumber and I have a plumber down the street.
Mm-hmm.
If you do what you do well enough and you market yourself the right way, the right people are going to find you and you're going to do business. What do you care what he's doing? Like, so the whole keeping up with the Joneses thing is not a thing for me in advising people in marketing, right? Like, so meaning, like, if that guy's doing all kinds of Google ads and YouTube ads and all this other stuff, and he's doing $3 million in revenue, and he's spending money over money over money to get that 3 million, and you're not spending that kind of money, but you're still doing 3 million because you're finding the right people at the right time under the right circumstances, then what do you care what he's doing? Like, why do you care? And then, like, to your point, like, the enemy gets a vote. Not in my scenario. That guy doesn't get a vote in what happens and what we do. That guy doesn't get a vote on how we proceed our business model or how we proceed with our business marketing, et cetera, et cetera. He doesn't get a vote. He doesn't have to take up any of your mind space.
Hello. So I'm going to do some shilling here, and hopefully this will be a pause in our riveting conversation for you. I have an offer for you. My most recent book is 12 Rules for Leaders, The Foundation of Intentional Leadership. It's available in paperback, hardcover, or as an ebook on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, and any other place you order books. Now, in this book, I address the 12 leadership areas that I have found leaders need to be the most intentional in to be the type of leader followers actually want to follow. From establishing a foundation of leading teams through managing conflict effectively, all the way through leading teams through change, knowing what to do and why to do it can help readers, like the ones listening to this show, become better leaders. Look, reading this book and living it is like getting coaching from me directly without having to pay my full coaching rate. Head on over to leadershiptoolbox.us. That's leadershiptoolbox.us, and scroll down the homepage and click on the Buy Now button to purchase in hardcover, paperback, and Kindle format on Amazon 12 Rules for Leaders, the foundation for intentional leadership. And that's it for me. Now back to the show.
And I think that that's some of those things that, like, I take from the difference between leadership styles between Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull. Crazy Horse's leadership style was, I will do whatever it takes to prove to you that I am worthy of you following me. And if that means jumping into the fire, then I'll jump into the fire. If that means if you want me to be first in battle, I'll be first in battle. Whereas Sitting Bull was more in the lines of, here's my philosophy. I have a philosophical way of thinking of things. If you agree with that philosophy, then you should fight my fight for me. Right? Like, I don't need to be on the front line because we agree in the same, we believe in the same things. And because you want to support that belief system, then you're a young man, you're gonna fight my fight for me. And I don't need to fight it because we share the same philosophies. It was a philosophical difference in leadership styles, but both of them were very effective.
Right. And you needed both of them. And this is the core point, I think, of the book. And it is the core point of what we're talking about today. In order to lead young men into battle, in order to harness the energies of young men, I want to talk a little bit about this in our next section here. But in order to harness the energies of young men, you need both of those. You need it's a hammer and tongs, right? Impact. And if you don't have both of those, and I wrote in my notes, I mean, to your point about Sitting Bull, he was much more inclined to be measured in thought. He consulted with Wakantanka, and he was slow to act. But here's the but about Sitting Bull. This is why I'm probably more Sitting Bull than I am Crazy Horse. But once that action was initiated, like, he was all in. He was like, okay, like, we're in for penny and for pound, Longshanks. Let's go all the way to the bitter end, whatever that end will be. And it's fine, right? And so I got a sense in reading this book and in the reporting, and I love how you framed it, the journalistic reporting of Mark Lee Gardner on this book. I got the sense that Sitting Bull understood he was in a tragic story, and he sort of was not fait accompli, but he was sort of, and I don't say comfortable either. He was okay with letting it play out the way it was going to play out, because he knew what the clearing at the end of the path had to be. And that doesn't make Sitting Bull tragic. Like, we tend to look at that through our lens, where we want people to be heroic and we want the winner to like have the victory and screw over the enemy, and, like I mentioned Marvel movies earlier, say some quip and then like flip off of the back of the helicarrier or some damn nonsense. That never happens in real life. What happens in real life is you make a decision, and I talked about this in World War I. I talked about this in War by Sebastian Junger. But you make a decision, and then you have to live with the consequences all the way to the end of whatever those consequences are. And don't get me wrong, we need Crazy Horses for sure. We need those guys. Because I don't think Sitting Bull couldn't have done the whole like rallying moral cry that Crazy Horse did. He couldn't have done that. He wasn't that guy. But he was the guy that could do what Crazy Horse couldn't, which is walk that path all the way to its logical end, even if that logical end meant his own death, which it did. And I think he knew that. I don't think he was ignorant to that.
Think about it from today's military structure. I mean, we basically still have that, right? The generals that lead from behind, that are more thought provoking, and they absolutely think beyond the battlefield and what happens when this war is over. How do I engage? How do I look that other general in the eye after this war is over with honor and dignity and respect? And whereas if you think about Crazy Horse, essentially like a lieutenant, right? Like, a lieutenant is on the battlefield with the troops, and he's got to rally the guys from a energy standpoint, not necessarily from a philosophical standpoint. I think we have the same kind of structure today. We just call them different things, like, right? It's like, because again, even like as like advisors, and Sitting Bull had Gall, and like there's other people that were like the in between of Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, almost like a melding of the two, where Gall would be perfectly okay jumping into battle, but he wanted to understand first and make sure that he had Sitting Bull's best interest in mind. So we have colonels and captains or whatever. Like I think we still have all that structure. We just call them. We have them more organized now, right? Like, it's just more. It's just more. There's more like literal structure to it versus having this open-ended kind of. All right, we're like, Crazy Horse is crazy. We're just going to let him go do his thing, but we're going to pick up the slack on the back end. Whatever that happens in that battle, we know that we're going to have some sort of communication and kind of sit down with what, like, so it was looser, and I know I'm kind of categorizing it the way that we would modern militaries, but I mean, let's face it, that's how it worked. Like,
well, I mean, and the ruthlessness of hierarchies is everywhere in human society. It's everywhere, every time. It's one of those human things. hierarchies are ruthless. And whether your hierarchy is loose or your hierarchy is tight, whether your hierarchy is informalized or whether it is formalized, it doesn't matter. Hierarchies are part of reality. And in our time, I opened up with talking about the egalitarianism, which is this idea that men and women are interchangeable. In the case of warfare, right? Historically speaking, men and women have not been interchangeable. And by the way, male hierarchies and female hierarchies are different. They are fundamentally different. And if you want to execute a war successfully, you have to know what kind of hierarchy you are in and what kind of hierarchy you are commanding. And that's just it. You just have to know. And you have to respect that hierarchy and not try to violate it or reshape it because of some ideological position that doesn't match. That's fine in a time of peace. It's fine to hold all the ideological positions that you want to hold in a time of peace. That's fine. But when it comes to the point, the inflection point, such as it were, where we're actually going to get down to this, now we got to move past ideology. We have to move into something else. Case in point, this is the section from the book that I want to read. So this is from The Earth Is All That Lasts. This is a chapter on the invasion of good horse grass country. And this was a quote from Fanny Kelly. And Fanny Kelly was a captive of the Lakotas. And she'd been captured by the Oglalas near Fort Laramie on July 12th and was traded to a hunk papa named Brings Plenty. And she was with the hunk papa for quite some time. And she actually she was used as an interpreter between the hunk papa and the white settlers who were leading a wagon train into territory that basically they didn't belong in, quite frankly. And so she tried to manipulate the negotiations because, of course, the native tribes thought that she was going to engage in good faith. She was not trying to engage in good faith. She was trying to get the heck away from them and get back to her family. And it wound up being a Pyrrhic victory for the hunk papas because they prevented the immigrant train from penetrating farther into Lakota lands. They had made them go home, but at an incredible loss of life, right? And Kelly later on wrote a book on her experiences, and Gardner references this book, which I find to be very interesting, by the way. A book on her experiences as a Sioux captive. And he says this: although with the Oglalas and then the hunk papas for only 5 months, she witnessed nearly everything that touched their daily lives. She even learned some of the Lakota language. And she did come to understand what drove them beyond the basic need to survive. And this is the quote here that gets to what I want to talk about today. This is the core of it. The youth are very fond of war. They have no other ambition and pant for the glory of battle, longing for the notes of the war song that they may rush in and win the feathers of a brave. They listen to the stories of the old men as they recall the stirring scenes of their youth or sing their war songs, which form only a boasting recapitulation of their daring and bravery. They yearn for the glory of war, which is the only path to distinction, close quote. Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse would not disagree. Paths to distinction for young men historically have been limited. A woman becomes a woman when she first menstruates because now she can have babies and create life. That's when a woman becomes a woman. But for a man to become a man, Tom knows this and I know this, yeah, it's a different thing. That's a long process. And in our modern society, we've sort of poo-pooed that. And we're now entering, and I'm seeing a lot of elite commentators and people smarter than me talking about the male crisis now. And occasionally this will pop up once every few years, but now it seems to have like sharpened to a point, because in a post-industrial society where manufacturing is not a thing, less than 5% of people are farmers in any sort of fashion. Most farming is done by large industrial outfits now, where military service is less than 1% of the available male population in the United States, and where the vast majority of men are going to be shuffled into, for good or ill, white collar jobs, where the opportunities for glory there aren't a whole lot of opportunities for glory when you're sending an email. There just aren't. There's no way to make that sexy.
Isn't that what we've replaced sports with? Like, aren't sports supposed to take over
Well,
some of that?
sports are, but we forget. So let's have an honest talk about men for just a minute, Tom. You played sports and I played sports. Now, I didn't play sports until I was into my 20s, because as a teenager, I was not going to be keel hauled into something that I didn't care about. I just wasn't. The line of rebellion had already been established by that point, and I just wasn't going to do anything that I didn't want to do. And so I did not play sports. I mean, I got involved in martial arts towards the end of my high school years, and that kept on going into my 20s. But I didn't start really playing an organized sport of any kind until I was in my 20s and when I was in college. You played football, you coached football. I presume that started fairly young for you, because most people do when they do football. Nothing wrong with that. And we all knew, you and I both knew, guys who wouldn't catch a ball if you paid them. They just wouldn't do it. They're not interested. And so while I appreciate that sports does exist as an outlet, I mean, I've got all my kids have done sports in one form or another. All my kids have did sports in one form or another. I think we've entered this weird sort of post-modern, post-industrial landscape where the choices are so broad that if young men don't want to do it, their parents aren't pushing them to do it. Now, the ones who are being pushed, obviously, are the ones we see who do it. But I'm shrugging my shoulders, by the way, on the video, folks. Like, you can't see that because this is just listen to the audio on the audio. But like, what do you do for all those? Here's a big question. And it is a question of our time. How do you channel the energies of young men so that they can get distinctions if the vast majority of them, if the paths to distinction are not what they used to be? How do you do that? Because that is the penultimate question of our time. And that was something that really jumped out to me in this book, was the paths to distinction for warrior young men. Like the young men here, the Lakota young men, I could have picked up those young men and put them in the Korengal Valley in Afghanistan, and they would have done exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
I could have given them a 50 cal, or I could have given them, I could have put them on the boats in Normandy. They would have done exactly the same thing. I could have put them in French Indochina at Dien Bien Phu, right? Or and in the what do you call it? The Idrang Valley during Vietnam. I could have put them in Korea. They were literally, it's the exact same kind of dude. They're looking for distinction, and the only way they know how to do this is through fighting war and counting coup and scalping and getting involved. And the way that he describes the battles is just kind of amazing. That part to me was exhilarating. Like, they're getting up after it. Like, you've got these cavalry boys, and they were boys, like 15 to 22-year-old boys, battling with these tribal warriors who are also probably their exact same age, and they're getting after it. They're looking for distinction. They're not out there by accident. The question of our time is, what do we do with our young men now? Because they have the same energies. That hasn't gone anywhere.
I was just about to say, that's where I think I may differ with you a little bit. I'm not sure they have the same energies. I'm not 100% convinced. I think I think it has started from such a young age, going like think about parents today, and by the way, you might even not purposefully done it, but think about, because I know you have some kids with some drastic age differences.
Oh yeah. Hmm.
Think of both of those two kids when they were a year or 2 years old. Did you interact with them differently? I
Oh yeah.
bet the answer is yes, right?
Oh
Like
yeah.
whether you
Hmm.
meant to or not, because I think there's there is there's a feeling about it, I guess, like from our generation, looking at these kids being born today and these young males, to your point, and we're trying to equalize everything so much that it's not simply just about lifting little girls up into thinking they can be whatever they want and do whatever they want, which by the way I totally agree with. I think that whatever they want to do with their life, go for it. I have no problem with a woman having ambitions of whatever, but it's not simply that. It's We're also taking young boys and saying, slow your roll there, buddy.
Hmm.
Like, so we're trying to suppress some of that from such a young age that by the time they get to teenagers, I don't think they have that fight in them, to be honest. I see a lot of teenagers today, male teenagers, that, I, I mean, it's really hard to explain because they don't go through the same trials and tribulations that we went through either. Like you
Right.
growing up or me growing up in the neighborhood that I did, I don't know if my kids would have even survived that. Never mind younger than them, because were you bullied as a kid?
Oh yeah.
Damn Skippy, you were.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Did you figure out how to deal with that bully on your own terms? Damn Skippy, you did.
Yes.
Did 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 that bully and you become best friends? Maybe, maybe not. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Because sometimes once you figure out the bully isn't really what he thinks he is, now you have to figure out, do you actually like him as a person? Like
Right.
that's different, right? So,
Yeah.
but we had to deal with all that. I'm sorry, but like 5-year-olds today getting bullied, their parents step in so fast and they try to figure that out for them. I just think that I don't know if they have the fight in them. You're saying that you think the fight's there, they just don't know what to do with it. I'm saying I don't know if the fight's still there.
So and
I'm
maybe
concerned that the fight's not there anymore. That's what my
well,
concern is.
and maybe my perception is colored because what are we an hour or we're an hour in on our conversation, an hour 15 minutes in, so now it's time to bring up jiu-jitsu. But like maybe my perception is colored because I do see young men in the jiu-jitsu classes that I coach. I do see young men when I coach soccer or other sports. Now, I will say this: the majority of young women in those places has increased in the
Sure.
years that I've been an adult,
Yeah.
and the number of young men in those places has decreased as I have become. Right. So I will say that to your point about the energies.
Well, and think
However,
of this for a second. Hold on one second, hey son. Just to add fuel to that fire, take a sport like football. Like you talked about, I played football. We
mhm,
had no qualms whatsoever about running at each other full speed and smacking the crap out of each other, right?
for sure.
But
Yeah.
now, they're basically trying to replace full contact football with flag football until they hit high school. Like there's a lot of movement saying that that type of physical activity at that age disrupts the mind. It has a lot of detrimental effect into the maturity of the brain. They're doing a lot of studies of saying like combat sports, whether it's football or martial arts, there's a direct link between those sports and a decline of cognitive thought processes later in life. So again, whether I agree with it or not is not the statement here, but I'm just
Sure.
saying, to your point, with the decrease in men in those sports, you're also seeing a decrease in full contact football, full contact rugby, full contact, all these things. Like you're seeing a decrease in it because my son, who by the way is 26, and I'm going to quote him here. So again, don't vilify me. These are not my words. My son basically calls it the wussification of America. Like he basically says that we're basically wussifying all of the male testosterone driven, male ego, male, all the stuff that you're talking about that these Lakota warriors had. We're purposefully trying to remove it from the equation.
Okay, so I think that is going to be to our detriment long term.
Maybe.
Because, as I said in the opening, in other parts of the world, pre-organized military parts of the world, where we keep going, not we keep, where we have recently decided that we're going to reduce the level of adventuring that we do in those spaces. The people who are still there, the people who are still doing the killing are, to a person, men. And they're not old men. So one of the things that, if you look back in history, the Greeks and the Romans did really well, which I think we don't do well in our society. They did conscription really well. And the Greeks and the Romans, like Socrates, okay, Socrates? No, Plato. Was it Plato or was it Aristotle? It was Plato. It was one of the big three philosophers. I think it was Plato. All y'all can correct me later on. But he actually served in a Greek hoplite. So the hoplite was basically the Greek version of infantry. It was the Greek version of these tribal warriors. It was the Greek version of the 7th Cavalry. He served in that all the way into his 40s, 50s, and 60s. So from the age of 15, or whenever you first got into a hoplite, I think it was probably younger than that, but let's say 15, all the way almost to death, he served. The Roman Empire, the way Rome worked, at least at the height of the Republic, and then in the transition to the Empire, the way Rome worked was you had to serve as a soldier for 20 years in the Roman Empire before you could be booted out, and you would get land and a wife. They would give you those two things until you go away, right? This is the whole like subplot of Gladiator, right? Like this is the whole thing he's trying to get back to, right? But it's true. I mean, there's historical truth to this, right? And those guys would literally serve for 20 years in the Roman army, in going around conquering people and getting their butts kicked too, like by the Germans and the Gauls and everybody else, right? Actually, I just said the same thing twice. But like they went off and made trouble, right? In a whole bunch of different places, right? Spain, Germany, France, everywhere, right? And as the empire expanded, the thing fell apart when you began inviting people who weren't exactly on the same ideological framework as the Romans to fight the wars, because to the point now that we have, Roman men declined and were unwilling to go into the Roman army. Fast forward 2,500 years to now, and I think there is cause for concern, and I'm going to use a big public example. Case in point. Just to anchor this. In our time, Europe has a war on its border between Russia and the Ukraine, right? And one of the things that the EU keeps agitating for, Zelensky actually brought this up, the prime minister of the Ukraine brought this up, probably 9 months ago. He ran over to England after being summarily booted from the White House, a significantly less cordial interaction than he had been used to previously from Joe Biden or somebody in Joe Biden's administration. He went back to England and he met with Keir Starmer, who's the UK prime minister. And what came out of that meeting was the idea, Zelensky floated this idea, that the modern European Union, who has even fewer young men that have participated in war than we do, should have its own European army that could be deployed into the Ukraine to fight the Russians. Zelensky proposed this. And he floated this idea, and as most ideas are floated with politicians or public policy makers, he floated it as a test just to see what the public would say. And of course, there was round rejection from all corners of the internet, and then it disappeared. My question about that was, which European young man are you going to get to fight for Europe? Because the only people you could potentially staff that army with are the Muslim immigrants who are coming over to places like London and Berlin and Barcelona and Paris. They seem to be very energized. They seem to have a lot of young male energy. They seem to be really interested in fighting. And they seem to be motivated to fight for something. Now, of course, this couldn't possibly work out terribly for you the way it worked out for the Romans.
And to prove their worth to a new country. That's the other part of it too that I think is.
Well, and even there, I would question their loyalties to the new country, but sure, let's throw that in as well, because maybe this won't be like the Ostrogoths and the Roman Empire. Maybe this won't work out that way, except maybe it will.
No, but there's a pathway to citizenship there, as is in the United States. You have people immigrating here; they serve in our military, and it's a path to citizenship.
Right. And the people who serve in the military in the United States as a pathway to citizenship already fundamentally believe, like the Mexicans already fundamentally believe, if you talk to them, that North America was theirs anyway. We're just historically, this is what La Raza is, the race, right? They just take the extreme version of this idea. We're just sewing back what was already ours. So for them, it's like, whatever. Also, you have people who serve in the military as a path to citizenship who, because our military is all volunteer and not conscription based, okay, not draft based, because of that, those young men are self-selecting into that thing, right? What the European Union was talking about and what was floated with Zelensky was a conscription force, because very, 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 very few, like a microscopic percentage of European young men from any of those countries are self-selecting into any, even the nation state militaries. Very few young men are self-selecting in. Self-selection hasn't worked. So they're going to have to call a draft. They're going to have to do conscription. And guess who they're going to conscript? Okay. I say all that to say this. God forbid we have to fight a nation state war against another country. I don't want to pick on Russia because that's too easy, and I want to pick on China because that's even easier. But God forbid we have to fight a nation state war against someone. India, let's just pick them.
The only country in the entire world that has never once declared war against another country. You want to pick on India?
Sure, I'm going to pick on India.
Sure.
All right. For this thought experiment.
Yeah. We're talking fantasy world. Go ahead.
We are talking fantasy world. We're not talking about the world that we live in. We're talking about another world, an alternate universe. Where are we going to find the energies? If the energies of the young men don't exist, where are we going to find the energies? You're going to tell me that young women are going to do it?
I mean, you don't know. Hey, son, come on, stop. You don't know. Maybe
I am too old and I've lived too long in the world to be fooled.
Yeah.
And I'm not making, I want to be very clear. I'm not making a right-wing argument or a left-wing argument. This is not about wings. This is not about politics. This is just a reality of a situation, right? And if we did pick an actual nation state actor who might actually make trouble, like China, they got a 200 million man army and it's men. It ain't women. And they've got young men who would be more than willing to cross over that big lake and show up at the door of San Francisco or LA or San Diego, knocking on the door saying, "We're here from Beijing. We're here to help." I don't doubt they've got 200 million of
them. Yeah.
I doubt highly we have 100,000 who would be willing. Actually, I doubt highly that we have 2 million young men who would be willing to go on defense. That's my thing. If the energies are where you say they are, if this is really the thing that's happening. Now, I'm not really convinced that that's the thing that's happening. But if we are convinced of that, okay, who's going to staff the military? Who's going to,
Well, I also wonder, I shouldn't say I think, I also wonder if there's something to be said about, as you were talking about earlier, modern warfare just being different. Do you need 2 million men to stand up and create a line and fight and form, or do you need 1,000 of them that can operate 3 drones at a time and just be willing to sit in a bunker somewhere in Texas and fly planes around the world? I mean, it's different today than it has been. But to your point, I still think there needs to be somebody willing to do that, but I don't know if the numbers are required anymore. I don't know if that's the but I guess it goes back to it. So then how do you prove your worth to yourself and to your community, to your significant other, to whatever? And
Right.
but I think that's all changing. It's changing on a daily basis.
I
But
mean,
again,
it's real. Like I said, it's really hard to prove your worth. I was actually just watching a clip of the movie Office Space before I walked in here. Like a buddy of mine was like, yeah,
I love that movie.
I love that movie. Love that movie so
Absolutely
much.
love that.
Oh my god.
Absolutely love that movie.
But like that movie was probably the beginning of the enculturalization, the acknowledgement at a cultural level that the energies of young men are moving in a different direction, or maybe are being suppressed. And by the way, I'll go into another one. So testosterone rates among young men are down. They are not where they used to be. Fertility rates are down in America. And I don't care what biology you ideologically want to hang your hat on, you still do need a male and a female to make a baby. And that's down, right? The rates of people hooking up, it isn't like it was when we were in our teens and 20s. Mm-hmm. That's all in the toilet. You also have dopaminergic tools that provide the same sort of psychological and biological kick, but without all the risk. Video games, porn, social media, OnlyFans, whatever, right? Like all these things are out here in the world. And so when it comes to the question of what do we do with young men, or how do we channel young men's energies, I don't think anybody has a good answer to that, because I think this is a real problem. And I will say this, the Sioux understood what to do. They understood what to do with the energies of their young men. They got it. They knew exactly what to do, because, by the way, it had worked for name your number of multiple millennia here, right? It worked for a millennia. Why not? I think that we lose something in our postmodern era when we just say, oh, well, those folks were just, and by the way, not just the folks in the native tribes. We also look at people in the 7th Cavalry as being savages too, quite frankly. We do. We use the same term. We would say, oh, those people were savages and they wasted their human potential, right? I mean, like the people that Custer was leading, those weren't kids. I mean, or they were kids, basically. Like they were the flower of the youth of particularly coming off the Civil War, where, what was it? 250,000 officially, 300,000, something like that. People, I shouldn't say people, 300,000 men had been died or wounded, right? So there wasn't that many dudes to go around. And Custer was taking dudes, and the 7th Cavalry was taking dudes, and Phil Sheridan and all those guys were taking guys, and they were saying, hey, here's an opportunity to prove your worth. Let's go kill some native peoples. And the native peoples were the young men in those tribes were more than willing to accommodate them. And Sitting Bull really didn't have to like do that much. It's one thing to talk about Crazy Horse, but Sitting Bull really didn't have to do that much to convince them, because they were already there. Okay. I think we still don't know what to do about young men. And I'm going to I got sons. I gotta figure this out, because my daughters are going to be fine. In the world that we are building, my daughters will be fine. They will be fine.
I agree.
Because
I just watch my daughter navigate through the world, and I agree with you. I'm like, she'll be fine. She's right. The one to worry about the least, honestly.
Right. And by the way, she will be fine. Not only your daughter and my daughters, not only will they be fine because of how the world has been restructured for them so that they can navigate through it without really having to have too much friction, but they will be fine because if all else fails, they can always fall back on their biology. If all else fails. If all else fails for young men, they can't fall back on their biology, not in the
Okay.
world that we've built. And I don't know what to do about that.
Anyway, back to the book, hey, so we're
Swing
not
round the
solving
corner.
we're not solving this world problem
No,
today.
we're not solving this problem today. No.
Listen, if I had my druthers, flag football wouldn't even be a thing, okay? Let me just say it that way. I'd rather smash heads and have a concussion or two in my childhood than not have experienced that. I think about like you don't know how to like could you imagine the first time you ever had your bell rung, you being in your mid-20s, not understanding what's going on or how to no, like if you get your bell rung in your early teens, and by the way, your brain recoups a lot faster in the early teens too. So having a concussion at 12 or 13 or whatever is not the worst thing in the world that could ever happen to a person. So but once you have one and you understand what it is, you understand how to act, you understand what to do with it, how to like now you have one in your 20s 10 years later and you're like, oh, okay, this is familiar, I know what I'm
Right.
doing with this,
Yeah.
like
Oh
it,
yeah. I mean, even the fact that I didn't play organized sports, in my teenage years, as I've just gone on about. And some people will interpret that defensively, but they can go to hell. So um, even with that, like the amount, as I told somebody else in a different kind of context, the only thing I really enjoyed between the ages of 12 and like 18 was fighting. That was my sport. That's what I enjoyed. I
same
enjoyed
idea.
mixing it up and getting in people's faces. And I was a skinny warrior. Like, I'm gonna go in there and we're gonna do the thing. And the last actual like physical altercation I had with someone who was gonna do violence to me was probably when I was in my late 20s. And so it's been a bit, it's been a minute, but guess what? I haven't forgotten the memory of all of those experiences, right?
Yeah.
There is an it's interesting. So I hear a lot of people talk, no, a lot of people will comment online and to me in public that I'll frame it as a question. They'll ask me this question: why are you doing jujitsu if you'll never use it? And then they'll follow that up with, well, that jujitsu stuff wouldn't work on me.
Yeah.
And I'm just like, the second you say that, that tells me, number one,
I own you.
I
I
own
own
you.
you.
I own you even without doing anything. That's number one. But number two, that tells me you've never actually had your bell rung. That tells me that you're part of that generation that didn't play the sports, didn't get knocked down, didn't have a whole lot of friction. If you did, it was as Mark, the comedian Mark Maron would say, thinky pain, psychological pain. But psychological pain, thinky pain, and physical pain are different.
Very.
They're not the same thing. And so what we miss is the linkage in people's brains, which can only come from taking a punch to the mouth sometimes. We're missing giving that opportunity to people. And so you say something like that to a person like me who's had those two things connect together in my head. And I just sort of look at you and I just go, you have a good day. And I just
Yeah.
walk. I have to stop talking to you. I have to put you on a back burner. And by the way, I've had women tell me, oh, well, I could take you, da 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 da. I'm like, ma'am, just, I'm a man. I got testosterone and man strength. And I've been hit by another grown man before. You don't have it. You just don't. Like, you think you do because you've been watching too many Marvel movies, as I said before, but you don't have this. It's a different thing. And I think too many folks in our society, because we've reduced that, to your point about flag football and contact sports and all of that, we've reduced people's opportunities to get real with reality, the physical hardness of reality. I do agree with you about that. And I don't know what we do about that. I don't know where the clearing at the end of the path. I'm going to be all Sitting Bull on this. I don't know where the clearing at the end of the path is on this. And I'm actually kind of afraid of what the clearing at the end of the path might be. I don't think it's going to look good. That's my script, folks. Back to the book. Back to The Earth Is All the Last. We're going to round the corner here. So, Mark Lee Garner, by the way, I would recommend getting this book. It's great. It's well researched, as we've talked about, plenty of notes. It goes into every last, oh, well, not every last piece, but the entire last half, the back half of Sitting Bull and Crazy Horses, engagement in life. And the probably the most important parts of the book are towards the end, after the wars are over. And this is where you get the difference between young men who are warriors seeking hierarchy and status and old men who have to come in and make the peace. And if not make the peace, at the very minimum, shake hands with the enemy who got a vote, whether we wanted them to or not. And it struck me that what happened with, or the ways in which the native tribes dealt with the U.S. government and were dealt with by the U.S. government, put me in mind of the line from Seven Pillars of Wisdom by T.E. Lawrence, talking about the difference between old men and young men. And he said this, and I quote, talking about, by the way, the old men at the end of World War I who sent the young men to die in the trenches. I've used this quote before, but I want to use it again here. And I quote, "We lived many lives in those whirling campaigns, never sparing ourselves." Pause for just a minute. I think the same could be said about those young men in those tribal wars. Back to the quote. "Yet when we achieved and the new world dawned, the old men came out again and took our victory to remake in the likeness of the former world they knew. Youth could win, but had not learned to keep, and was pitiably weak against age. We stammered that we had worked for a new heaven and a new earth, and they thanked us kindly and made their peace." Yeah. Now, I didn't say the peace was fair, nor did I say the peace was equitable. Let me be very clear. It was neither fair nor equitable. It was oppressive, is probably the correct word. Not probably. It is the correct word to use. And yet, this is the challenge. This is the difference between old men and young men. And I guess my question here for Tom towards the end is, how do old men honor the sacrifices of young men when they have to make peace with the enemy? How does that happen? I think Sitting Bull tried, but I don't think he really knew how.
It's a really darn good question. Because again, I don't think there's a real satisfactory answer to that. I mean, again, think about it from in this in this framework that we're talking about here. Sitting Bull lost a lot of brave warriors, lost a lot of fighters, lost a lot of friends in these wars. And how do you honor them? I think in their minds at the time, and again, I'm not suggesting that I know what they were thinking, but from a retrospective position, I think they're thinking of in the sense of those warriors fought to protect their people. If in the end Sitting Bull can protect his people through negotiation, they still did not die in vain, because the people and the people are ultimately protected, right? So
Yeah.
again, I think ultimately how Sitting Bull can look at himself in the mirror and think that he is still doing a good job as their leader, as the leader of those people, is the fact that the Lakota are still here today. We can say what we want about how many died and useless deaths and all this other stuff about warfare and whatnot. But if you think about the legacy behind Sitting Bull and in his people since, they're still here. Now, are they thriving? you can say, you can argue that they're not. You can argue, and for those of you who don't know, some of the reservations that our native people are living on today, if they were not in the middle of the United States, if you removed them and put them anywhere else in the world, they would be considered third world countries. You have these people living in environments that would be considered third world countries if they were anywhere else on the planet. But
Mhm.
because they sit in the borders of the United States, they don't get classified that way. They also don't get treated that way, so they don't get the help that they need. But the Pine Ridge Reservation is an atrocity to human nature. I mean, I'm trying to be very careful how I word this because I also do not want to disrespect my, my westward cousins here in a sense that I don't think they necessarily want our help either. I think they want to try to figure it out. So there's that. And that goes back to the legacy of people like Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, where they're going to fight, even if the fight is a little bit different, they're going to fight today just as they fought 100 years ago for the survival of their people and the protection of their people. So I think I think it's a hard question to answer, but I think ultimately if you are a warrior in 1860, 1870, 1880, your your mental your faculties are telling you that you are fighting beyond the I want to position myself as it has been accomplished something. What drives that really is protecting your people. Like you put yourself on the front line so that your people are able to live the way they want to live. I think the same rule applies today for some of that. And I think that Sitting Bull was the bar to be measured by in that
Yeah.
respect. He ultimately he made so many sacrifices. He refused to back down. He refused to give in. He crossed the border into Canada for the same reasons. He dragged hundreds of people that followed him across the border, hundreds of miles out of principle, came back out of the same principle, out of negotiation of peace and trying to protect his people. So I think all that applies, right? Like there's a lot of and I think that's kind of the same. We talked about that, like as you look at some of these wars and the young men fighting these wars, and then the generals sitting behind the desks. The generals are the ones negotiating the peace treaties on the side over here because they don't want to lose any more of their young men. Eh, I think who backs down in that is not relevant as to how the mentality of it is on both sides, whether you win or lose those battles, you're signing that treaty to protect your men from themselves.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of what Sitting Bull was the mentality there. I'm going to protect my warriors from themselves because they have the attitude of I'll fight till the death and I'll fight to
Right.
die. It doesn't matter because if my people are going to be in peril, it's not going to be because of me,
Hmm. Hmm.
right? Like I'm going to if my people are not going to be able to survive and thrive, then I don't want to witness it. So I won't be
Right.
alive to do so. They're going to have to kill me in order to get that done. So and again, and Sitting Bull ultimately did give his life in the end for this peace at in 1890 at Wounded Knee. That like not at the Battle of Wounded Knee, but it was right prior,
Right.
just
Right.
before that. It
Yep.
was basically the catalyst to Wounded Knee, the death of Sitting Bull. So I think he accomplished what he set out to accomplish was, he was going to give his life to make sure his people were able to survive and move beyond this where they were stuck, so to speak, in that limbo state.
Well, and I mean, we talked a little bit about this in the introduction episode. Um, yes, this is a book about channeling the spirits of young men into war, and it matches up with everything else that we've been reading about, whether those young men again are in the Korengal Valley, or they are on the fields and in the trenches of Europe in World War I, or if they are in Korea or Vietnam or wherever, right? Um, can't remember who it was or what movie I saw it in, and it doesn't really matter. But some soldier once nihilistically and existentially said, one day this war is going to be over. And it's true. One day war will be over. Not in all of human history. I don't think we're going to get to the end of war before we get to the end of human history. Like, quite frankly, from my perspective, Jesus has to come back before even that happens. That's my thought on that. We'll have warfare until the end of time, but the individual war, right? The war is going to end. One of the other books that we're going to cover the next couple of weeks is titled "Farewell to Arms" by Ernest Hemingway, and it is his semi-autobiographical story of his experiences as an ambulance driver in World War One. And one of the things that pops out in that, and I think he would have had a lot of simpatico with the young men of the Lakota and those young Lakota warriors, and I think he would have also had a lot of simpatico with the 7th Cavalry. It's something that they all shared all the way up and down the line, I think, was this idea that at a certain point, the warrior spirit is emptied out and the war just has to be done. That's one of the things that comes through in A Farewell to Arms. And he talks a lot with the other Italian soldiers about how this war has to end because we're exhausted, right? And the point that the older men make, interestingly enough, to Hemingway, is that the old men don't know how to end it. The old men don't know how to end the war. And until the old men get exhausted, this war isn't going to end.
Because then they're not exerting the same amount of energy.
Exactly. And this is where I come to sort of my last conclusion from this great book. The job of older leaders, and we don't like talking about age because it's ageism and it feels like we're segregating people. And the reality of age is the job of older leaders is to engage with wisdom. The job of older leaders is to, as Kenny Rogers said way back in that old song, The Gambler, know when to hold them and know when to fold them. Yeah, know when to walk away and know when to run. And if young people, not sounding just about young men, if youthful energy doesn't have that wisdom and will expend itself, older leaders have to know when to stop that and cease that and redirect that. And it is a failure of leadership, like in World War One, the massive failure of leadership. Like that war should have been over in 2 years. Massive failure of leadership because the old men didn't know when to tell the young men to stop. Hell, the old men didn't know when to stop themselves. And that's a massive failure of leadership. And to our point that we made earlier, with our new technologies, the stopping points need to be sooner because we can do so much more damage now with our new technologies. A young man with a $20 million drone can kill more people than a Lakota warrior could have ever dreamed of. And that's just that. All the while looking at it like it's a video game, like it's Call of Duty or something. It's not, because you're killing real people with real consequences. But this is the mindset that has to be channeled and the energies that need to be bounded by the wisdom of old age and experience. We haven't really resolved anything today, as usual.
No.
We haven't really resolved anything. We haven't gotten any conclusions to any questions. What do you think leaders should take from The Earth Is All That Lasts? What should they take if they read this book? Final thought.
I think I alluded to it earlier. I think there's a good comparison to the leadership styles between the two people, between Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull. I think they're distinctly different. I don't think one is more valuable than the other, but I definitely think that there are things to be learned by the two different styles of leadership. Again, we talked about Crazy Horse leading by example, being in the forefront, being out on the in the front of the battles. And today's leaders, I don't know about you, but I've spent time in a lot of different industries. I take the restaurant industry very I care about it very deeply in my heart because I started there. And as a restaurant manager and somebody who was running a lot of people, I would have no hesitation whatsoever to roll up my sleeves and wash dishes. And when my team saw that the general manager of the restaurant was willing to wash dishes, they never questioned me if I asked them to go wash dishes. They would just go do it because they knew that I was willing and able and capable, and more than I would do it myself if I could. If I didn't have this in front of me to do it, I would do it. Sweeping the floors. There was no job in the restaurant industry that was beneath me. And I think my team saw that and responded as such, being like, if it's not beneath me, then why would it be beneath them, any of them? So there's lead by example. And again, Sitting Bull led by philosophy, right? So you believe in the same thing I believe in. I'm not physically capable of doing, let's say in the restaurant business, if I was beyond the point where I could mop that floor or fix the oven or whatever it was, and I asked somebody younger to me to do it, they would do it because philosophically they know that I would do it if I could, right? Like, so it's like there's different styles of leadership in this book, and I think if you know yourself well enough to know which one of those styles you're going to lean into, I think you could learn something from both of these two guys. I think you can absolutely learn something from the book that would resonate with you. You just basically lean toward one or the other. And I don't necessarily think it has to I don't think you necessarily have to pick one or the other. I think there's ways to grow into different forms of leadership as well. Maybe you start out as a leader like Crazy Horse and you end up as a leader like Sitting Bull. I think to me that's a natural progression. So I think knowing and understanding the two different styles of leadership in there could absolutely help you in your day-to-day life if you are in that leadership role in your company, in your family, in your life, or whatever. I definitely think that you could learn from these two Lakota chiefs.
Awesome. Great final word. And so I will say with that, well, we're out.
Thank you for listening to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast today. And now that you've made it this far, you should subscribe to the audio version of this show on all the major podcast players, including Apple iTunes, Spotify, YouTube Music, and everywhere else where podcasts are available. There's also a video version of our podcast on our YouTube channel. Like and subscribe to the video version of this podcast on the Leadership Toolbox channel on YouTube. Just search for Leadership Toolbox and hit the subscribe button there on YouTube. And while you're doing that, leave a 5-star review if you like what we're doing here on Apple, Spotify, and YouTube. Just go below the player and hit 5 stars. We need those reviews to grow, and it's the easiest way to help grow this show. And tell all your friends, of course, in leadership. By the way, if you don't like what we're doing here, well, you can always listen to another leadership show. There are several other good ones out there. At least that's what I've heard. All right. Well, that's it for me.